Who doesn't like a recommendation video? So this particular video is going to be like if you like this, try this book. But it's going to be based on the first book in the series alone. A bit of a disclaimer, some of the series I have read the entire series and some I've only read like the first book. But I couldn't help but notice when I was reading these books to compare it to the other books, and that's why it made it onto the list. I will be starting with like YA and then kind of moving more to adult. If you're not interested in one, I'll leave timestamps and you can kind of follow through that. So without further ado, let's get to it. So the first one is If You Liked the Grishaverse by Leigh Bardugo. You may like Darkwater Daughter by H.M. Long. I always screw up her name, I'm so sorry. I'm comparing this book more towards Shadow and Bone, but unlike the Grishaverse, this is actually an adult book. The reason why I want to compare these two is because I feel like the worlds are very similar. They're very dark, kind of like almost set around the same time, a lot of nautical stuff happening, and the main character has a power that is being used by lots of people. It's not a romantasy, but it is a romantic fantasy, but it is a bit of a darker world, a little bit more like Pirates of the Caribbean inspired. So I think if you do like Grishaverse, you may enjoy this book as well. Currently there are 2 books out and the third one is coming out in late 2025. I have a separate video reviewing this book, so I will link it above if you want to check it out. If you liked The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick, if you liked this story for the atmosphere, for the costumes, for a protagonist that has a dual persona, one being an elite society and the other being a caped crusader, so to speak, in the dark at night. There's also a theme of a main protagonist being very close to a person who is trying to hunt her. If you liked The Mask of Mirror for that, I highly recommend The Heartless Hunter by Crescent City. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. This book is a YA book, and I'm actually currently reading it, but while I'm reading it, I cannot help but compare it to The Mask of Mirrors for the elements that I mentioned before. We have a witch who is being hunted by a witch hunter. She has a dual persona, one being in the elite society and the other being a vigilante at night wearing a mask trying to save the witches. It has an element of lots of costumes, lots of details and designs, almost like the nighttime ballroom feel that you get from this one, you also get from this one as well. Although this is an adult book and it is actually quite complex, I do recommend, if you like this, checking out this, or if you read this book and you want something similar, you can try this one. If you're moving from this one to this one, it is quite the difference because this is very detailed. The Rook on the Rose is a completed trilogy, and The Heartless Hunter is an ongoing series with the second one coming out in January 2025. Since we are talking a little bit about romantasy, I wanted to say if you liked The Crescent City by Sarah J. Maas for the urban fantasy setting, for the spicy scenes, for the epic battles and the fae, and just a woman trying to navigate a urban setting, I highly recommend checking out the Fever series by Karen Marie Moning. I'm actually holding up like the 4th in the series because I actually don't own the first one, which is Dark Fever. I do own the first one. It's a banged up mass-produced paperback and it's not worth showing, but I have this beautiful hardcover. Sorry, I'm gonna switch these because the light. I do have to mention that this series is a bit dated, but if you want the same kind of like thrill that you get from Crescent City, I highly recommend checking out this series. I cannot remember how many books there are. There's definitely more to catch up on. So if you like urban setting with sexy fae, I highly recommend checking out this series. Speaking of urban fantasy, if you like the Dresden Files for that urban fantasy setting with a lot of different characters and supernatural sidekicks and a mage type person who is very snarky, I highly recommend checking out The Hollows by Kim Harris. This is the first book, Dark Witch Walking. I just finished this not too long ago and absolutely loved it. As far as urban fantasy first books go, this one really stood out. I find that most urban fantasies, their first books are probably the weakest, and if this is the weakest, consider me like obsessed. I've only read the first 3 books in this series, but I know that it gets incredibly epic. And already from this one, I can tell that it also gets incredibly epic. You can tell by the more recent covers that have been published. So this series is kind of interesting because it is following a witch in almost like a post-apocalyptic world. They're living in a world where a virus has ravaged all of like the human race, so there's not a lot of human race left, and the existence of like supernatural beings such as vampires, witches, all that stuff is now light. Humans are very wary of the supernatural beings and they kind of live separately. So in this world we have a witch who works for like almost like a detective agency, but she decides she wants to quit, and in doing so they put a death warrant on her head, so now she's like struggling. But then she kind of gets rescued by like this vampire woman, and she's got a pixie sidekick, and there's a lot of fun that happens in this book that really reminded me of Dresden Files. Although this is an urban fantasy romance, the first book has literally just as much as romance as this first book. So like I'm sure maybe it gets spicier later on, but as it stands, like the same amount of romance. So if you like urban fantasy, I really do recommend you check this out. The next one is pure fantasy, and that is if you liked City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. For the Middle Eastern settings, for the jinn, for the very magical sandy desert setting, I highly recommend checking out The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. These 2 books were like so similar, not really in plot because this is more like an Aladdin retelling, but like so similar in setting and world building and folklore that I couldn't help comparing these 2. This has more romance in it than this one does as of so far. There's only one in this series. For some reason, the sequel was supposed to come out 2 years ago and it still has not come out, so I'm not sure what that says, but I really did enjoy this first book. So if you like this one, I highly recommend checking out Stardust Thief. So my next recommendation is actually a recommendation that I make because while I just finished this book, I couldn't help comparing it to another book that I absolutely love. So the book that I'm talking about is The Godkiller by Hannah Kenner. I recently talked about this in one of my vlogs, and I will be talking about it in my October wrap-up. But yes, this book is like a YouTube darling, very beloved thanks to Elliot Brooks. It's following a godkiller that finds herself caught up with a young girl who is connected to a god. Both the god and the girl wish to be separated, so they ask this godkiller to come help them. Although this book didn't really work for me, what worked for me was the gods. The way that they are described, the way that they are, and the things that they do in order to get worshippers. So if you liked that aspect like I did, then I highly recommend, I'm going to have to switch it again. Then I highly recommend The Iron Crown by L.L. McRae. This one really took me by surprise. I picked it up a couple years ago, but it was the world of the dragons that absolutely made this book amazing. And the dragons and the gods are very similar, and they need worshippers in order to be stronger. So if you liked that aspect of the gods, I think that you will really like this one. There is also a found family aspect, which is in both of these, and I really enjoyed that as well. Both of these books only have 2 books out in the series, but there's more coming out soon. So if you like Godkiller, I highly recommend checking out Iron Crown. We are switching it up with a dark fantasy, and that is The Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. This is about a vampire hunter telling his story in a very weird vampire world. We're in a world where the sun does not rise anymore, so therefore vampires are reigning free. There's nothing holding them back. And it is a very bleak, grim world. If you like this dark, grimdark world where the bad guys are kind of like rampant and taking over, and a person telling their life story, then I highly recommend Along the Razor's Edge by Rob J. Hayes. This is one of my favorite series of all time. I absolutely love this series, and it is about Asuka, who is basically considered the bad guy, telling her life story of how she became the big bad guy. And it starts in a very grim world where she is basically a prison in this like horrible prison called the Pit. People are worked to the bone, and there's a lot of gods and demons and stuff like that. Because the worlds are very similar, and it is a main character telling their life story, if you like The Empire of the Vampire, I highly recommend checking out Along the Razor's Edge by Rob J. Hayes. You won't regret it. So we're going to switch it up to sci-fi right now. And I'm going to have a little bit of a disclaimer that this one, out of all the ones I'm recommending, is probably the least likely to work for a lot of people. And I will explain why in a second. So if you like the Expanse series, starting with Leviathan Wakes, I'm trying to struggle how to say this without giving too much away about this one, but there is an aspect of a weird, almost like parasite disease that's in this book, that's also in the book that I'm about to recommend. Plus, this is about like a ragtag team of like a found family on a ship, and there is an element of a romance in this book. The next book I'm about to recommend is technically a romance sci-fi, and that is The Blighted Stars by Megan E. O'Keefe. These two both share like that weird parasitic thing that is really prevalent in both books. Both involves a romance involving two strong women. So if you liked that aspect of this book, then I highly recommend checking out this book. I can't say that for the average reader who doesn't like romance will enjoy this one. I will say that this first book is more on like a weird, creepy horror stuck on a planet book, whereas the second book is more like this one. The Expanse is a 9-book series that recently got completed, and also the Devouring Worlds trilogy also recently got the last book in the series as well. So if you liked the creepiness and the romance of this one, then I highly recommend checking out this one. The next two books I would like to recommend is if you like the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu, for the awesome world building, for the political scheming, for the character that is doing his best to rise up from the bottom and rule a kingdom, and for also the Asian-inspired world. I highly recommend checking out The Daughter of the Empire by Raymond E. Feist and Jenny Warts. I've only read the first 2 books in this series, and I've only read this one, but while I was reading this one, I couldn't help compare it to The Grace of Kings. This book is about a young girl who finds herself becoming the ruler of an empire, and her navigating this empire when nobody wants her there. Very rich world building, and also the political scheming that happens. These two are very similar. So if you want more of the Dandelion Dynasty, I highly recommend checking out the Empire series. I think that's called the Empire series by Raymond E. Feist and Jenny Warts. You won't regret it. One of these is also a recent read, so that's why I'm bringing it up. If you like The Fellowship of the Rings by Tolkien, basically the world that Tolkien created. The elves, the dwarves, the humans, the dragons, although the dragons aren't really in this one, but the dragons are in The Hobbit. But you get what I'm saying. For that world that he created, for a team of people that have a goal and they have to get from point A to point B. If you enjoyed The Fellowship of the Rings, I highly recommend checking out, oh my god, this is so heavy, The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams. I recently just finished this book, and although the beginning is kind of similar, you both have young people who are starting off in their hometown or village or whatever, and then somehow find themselves swept up into an adventure with mystery and all sorts of different types of creatures. There's like a big bad trying to chase them. Also, this world is very similar, where you have the dragons and the different people, but this one doesn't have elves. They have something a little bit different, but it's very similar. And also the writing is quite similar as well. This book also inspired A Song of Ice and Fire, so if you're a fan of that series, check out this one as well. That is the end of my recommendation video. If you like this video, think about giving it a big like and possibly subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. All of my socials are linked down below, including my Discord. And thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day. Bye!